In the heat of a summer that seemed to carry no end, when the stones of Athens glowed like coals beneath the unrelenting sun, the city waited. War pressed against its gates, Spartan armies encamped beyond its walls, and inside the people huddled in restless suffocation. It was not swords they feared most, but hunger, thirst, and the weight of confinement. The air thickened with the stench of too many bodies packed too close, of beasts and men pressed into the same narrow streets. And then, through this sweltering crucible, something unseen slipped silently among the man-intruder, without form, a phantom carried in breath, in touch, in water. No trumpet announced its arrival. It was first a cough, a fever, a weakness in the limbs, then it was fire beneath the skin, tongues swollen and dry, eyes burning with delirium. Thucydides, soldier and historian, himself sickened but survived, and left words that still breathe across centuries. He described men whose thirst could not be quenched, who hurled themselves into fountains, clawing at water like animals while their bodies convulsed with heat. He told of faces blackened, throats filled with ulcers, of the sick lying upon the dead in heaps where they had crawled for shade and collapsed upon one another. He wrote that priests, sworn to serve the gods, fell at their altars, their prayers drowned by the rattle of their own lungs. Families vanished in days, mothers cradled lifeless children. Fathers carried fevered sons into the streets and never returned. The silence of mourning was drowned by the ceaseless tolling of death. The city, proud jewel of Greece, fortress of democracy, now stank of decay. The temples overflowed with corpses. The funeral pyres burned day and night until the smoke choked the heavens. When no more wood could be found, the dead were piled into mass graves, unmarked, unnamed, flesh upon flesh, noble and beggar alike. Men, stripped of hope, abandoned sacred rites, stealing pyres from strangers or hurling their loved ones into fires not their own. The reverence of Athens, the rituals, the customs, the gods themselves seemed to wither beneath the weight of death, and as bodies fell, so too did order. Men who once feared the law cast it aside, for who would live to enforce it? In the shadow of fever, gold and virtue lost their meaning. Some drank deeply, feasted, surrendered to desire, believing each day to be their last. Others fled, abandoning kin to the silence of their chambers. What need was there for justice? Athens, city of philosophers and poets, of marble and ideals, staggered into chaos, its soul unraveling as swiftly as its flesh. The war with Sparta did not cease. Armies pressed still upon the walls. Yet it was not the Spartan spear that bent Athens toward ruin. It was the whisper of this unseen plague. Generals, soldiers, citizens alike collapsed in the dust, their strength stolen by fever before a single strike of iron could fall. Even Pericles, the great leader whose voice had once commanded hope, succumbed within his chamber, his body trembling, his lungs failing. His death sent a shudder through the city greater than any enemy blow. For what was Athens without Pericles, without the vision of its immortality? And still, no one knew what demon had entered their midst. Was it carried by ships from distant Egypt? Was it born in the marshes, summoned by the gods as punishment for pride? Was it typhus, smallpox, some pestilence, nameless and now forgotten? By time, scholars debate, physicians guess, but the bones of Athens hold their silence. What remains certain is its weight. The plague hollowed the city, weakened its armies, and carved deep cracks into its democracy. In the years that followed, the war ground mercilessly on, but Athens was no longer the same. Its voice, once unshaken, faltered, its glory dimmed. Its people, haunted, remembered not only the swords of Sparta, but the phantom that stole into their homes with invisible hand. In the night air of Athens, the echoes of that summer still seem to linger. If you walk among the ruins, past the Parthenon's pillars and the stones worn smooth by centuries of feet, you may feel it a hush, a shadow in the wind, as though the city still remembers the silence of its fevered dead. History asks whether it was fate or folly that brought Athens low. Was it pride that sealed the city's gates, trapping death inside with its people? Or was it destiny, a reminder that even the most radiant of civilizations can be brought to its knees by something smaller than sight? The plague left no monument, no grand statue or inscription carved into stone, yet it carved itself into memory, into the very shape of history. Athens, the immortal city, learned its mortality in blood and ash, in thirst and fever, and long after the smoke of its pyres vanished into the sky, the question endures, whispered like a ghost across time. What force decides the fall of empires, the strength of enemies, or the breath of unseen shadows? In that silence lies the true mystery, one Athens could never answer. And so the shadow remains, drifting still over stone and dust, a reminder that no city, no empire, no dream, however golden, is immune to the hand of plague. A hush fell upon the empire, not the silence of peace, but the silence of fear. Rome, mighty Rome, whose eagles had soared from the sands of Arabia to the cliffs of Britannia, whose legions ground nations into dust beneath their sandals, now trembled before an enemy without banner or blade. It did not march, it drifted. It clung to the breath of soldiers returning from the east, unseen upon their cloaks, hidden in their coffs. And when it came with no mercy. The year was 165, when Marcus Aurelius sat upon the throne, a philosopher king who sought to temper Rome's ambition with wisdom. But no wisdom could stop what slipped past Rome's gates. Fever rose like fire, unseen but all-consuming. Men awoke in sweat, seized by chills that shook their bones like reeds in a storm. Then came the sores, cruel blossoms upon the skin, red and burning, blooming across the body until flesh seemed a garden of death. Within days, strength melted. The mighty collapsed beside the weak garrisons, withered where they stood, and temples filled with bodies waiting for burial. The empire that had marched with iron discipline now stumbled, staggering under a sickness that spread faster than roads could carry news. Villages emptied, towns turned silent, the great markets of the eternal city fell quiet, their stalls deserted. Even the Colosseum, once deafened by the roar of blood sport, grew still. The laughter of Rome, its shouts, its festivals, its musical, were swallowed in a hush that echoed from stone to stone. The people whispered that the gods had turned their faces away. Perhaps it was vengeance for Rome's pride, for the blood of conquered lands. Some said Apollo, bringer of plague, had loosed his arrows upon the city, his wrath carried by the breath of men. Others believed it punishment drawn from the east, carried home by soldiers who had marched too far into lands not meant for them. Whatever the truth, Rome had no answer. Even emperors were not immune. Lucius Verus, co-ruler with Marcus Aurelius, fell to the sickness, his body consumed by the same fire that devoured peasants in the fields. Senators died in their villas, generals in their tents, slaves in their barracks. Death was no respecter of rank. The empire that prided itself on hierarchy, on order, found itself leveled by a shadow. All men were equal before the fever, the streets filled with funeral carts, creaking beneath the weight of bodies. Fires burned day and night, their smoke veiling the city in a haze that clung to the lungs and stung the eyes. The Tiber itself seemed to carry sorrow in its current, reflecting not the golden light of Rome's monuments, but the black pall of endless pyres. And still the sickness spread, as if each breath carried a curse, as if the very air was poisoned. Thucydides had once written of Athens' plague, but now Rome wrote its own lament in sweat and blood. Chroniclers spoke of entire households wiped out. For 15 years the plague ebbed and surged, a tide of pestilence that could not be turned back. It thinned the ranks of Rome's legions, drained its coffers, stripped its fields of laborers, its temples of priests. Yet perhaps the greater wound was not to flesh, but to faith. For Rome had long believed itself eternal. Its stones, its laws, its gods untouchable, enduring. But now its citizens looked upon their empire and saw fragility. The marble cracked, not from the hammer of enemies, but from the invisible weight of disease. The people wondered if the gods could not shield them, if Rome itself could sicken, what then was eternal? In the darkened chambers of the palace, Marcus Aurelius is said to have written by candlelight, his meditations etched against despair. He counseled calm endurance, the acceptance of fate. Yet even he, the philosopher emperor, could not silence the tremor of uncertainty that passed through his city. For he too watched his armies diminish, his people fade, the empire itself trembling, like an old man in the grip of fever. Some believe it was smallpox, a cruel visitor with its pustules and its scars. Others whisper it was something else, some pestilence now vanished from the earth. The truth remains lost in the ashes of the pyres, in the dust of bones that carry no answers. All that remains is the memory of Silencean empire hushed, a voice faltering. The Antonine plague did not end Rome. The empire endured, its banners still raised, its legions still marching. But something had shifted, something unseen but profound. The strength of Rome was no longer unshakable. The idea of its immortality had cracked, and from that crack the slow unraveling began. For perhaps it is not in great battles that empires fall, but in whispers, in shadows, in the breath of sickness that leaves no monument behind. When we think of Rome, we see marble, columns, triumphal arches, the gleam of bronze and steel. But in truth, its story is also written in fever, in coughs carried across silent streets, in pyres that turned night into day with their endless glow. The plague carved itself into the empire's memory, not as a loud shattering, but as a silence that lingered, heavy and enduring. And as we listen across the centuries, as the stones of Rome whisper their secrets to the night, we hear not only the echoes of armies, of emperors, of conquest, but the faint, the kind of whisper that coils through the air unnoticed, until one day the silence is broken by the sound of wailing. The year was 541, and Constantinople, jewel of the Byzantine Empire, still gleamed in the sun like a city favored by the gods. Its domes caught the dawn's first light. Its markets pulsed with the language of traders from every corner of the known world. Its streets were crowded with priests, soldiers, merchants, beggars, all mingling beneath the shadow of Hagia Sophia's great rising walls. The empire was vast, stretching from the deserts of Egypt to the waters of the Adriatic, and the capital stood at its heart, a city of stone and gold, guarded by the sea and believed to be eternal. But eternity is fragile, and in that year something rode upon the waves, hidden in the holds of ships that brought grain from Egypt, along with the food that fed the empire. The rats scurried ashore, their fleas drunk with a darkness unseen. It did not announce itself with trumpets or banners. It was not a foe the legions could repel with shield and spear. It crept silently, unseen, into the veins of the city. The first to sicken were brushed aside as accidents, a fever here, a cough there. But then the numbers grew. Men staggered through the streets with swellings upon their flesh, black buboes rising beneath arms and upon thighs, burning with fire. Their skin darkened, their breath grew foul, their eyes clouded. Soon bodies collapsed in the markets, at the docks, in the very courtyards of the imperial palace. Death became the city's new rhythm, a pulse louder than bells or prayers. Procopius, he told of corpses stacked in heaps, abandoned as if they were logs of wood. He told of the emperor himself, Justinian, seized by fever, trembling upon his bed. All Constantinople held its breath, fearing the empire would lose its heart. But Justinian survived, though the city around him lay shrouded in mourning. Each day the dead multiplied. The priests sang funeral chants without pause, their voices hoarse, echoing across streets lined with bodies. The graveyards overflowed, their soil too shallow, too thin to hold the tide of flesh. Carts rumbled through the alleys, not filled with wares or harvest, but with corpses stacked high, creaking like ships beneath a cargo of death. When the earth could no longer drink the bodies, they were hurled into pits, into towers, into the sea itself. The stench clung to the city like a curse, and yet the sickness did not relent. It seemed to feed upon fear itself, spreading with greater hunger the more the people prayed. Some believed it divine anger, punishment from God for sins too great to name. Others thought it was the devil's hand, tearing at the heart of Christendom's proudest city. Physicians tried to cut the swellings, to bleed the afflicted, to burn herbs and purify the air. But nothing stilled the plague's advance. For 4 long months it ravaged Constantinople. Procopius claimed that at its peak 10,000 souls were taken each day. Whether truth or exaggeration, the effect was the same: the city was brought to its knees. The markets emptied, the courts fell silent, the streets became graveyards. Even dogs would not touch the bodies. The empire that dreamed of restoring Rome's glory now seemed itself on the edge of extinction. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it began to wane. The fever loosened its grip, the buboes ceased to swell, the chants of mourning softened, the shadow receded, leaving behind not triumph but silence. Constantinople lived on, but scarred, haunted, and hollowed. Some said a quarter of its people were gone, others half. What was this thing that had come and gone like a storm? Was it the same pestilence that would, centuries later, sweep across Europe as the Black Death, leaving its blackened handprint upon history? Was it chance, the movement of trade and tide, or was it judgment, divine or infernal, called down upon an empire that sought to be the new Rome? Even now, the silence of those questions is heavier than the graves that line Constantinople's soil. The empire endured, as empires do. Justinian rebuilt his armies, raised new monuments, dreamed again of conquest. But something within the heart of Byzantium had shifted. The grandeur of its stones, its cathedrals, its laws all were now shadowed by the memory that even the greatest city could be brought low by a whisper in the blood. And so, when the sun sets over the Bosphorus and the water turns black as polished obsidian, one might still hear it, the echo of chants, the rattle of carts heavy with the dead, the hush that falls when a city understands its own mortality. The plague of Justinian was not just an affliction of bodies. It was a revelation that no empire, however gilded, however divine it deems itself, is beyond the reach of silence. In the end, Constantinople survived. But survival is not immortality. The city was forced to live with the memory of its fragility, to carry the invisible scar of a shadow that once emptied its streets. And in that scar lies the true story, the story of an empire that looked into the abyss of its own ending. And though it stepped back, it never forgot the chill of that gaze. In the half-light before dawn, when shadows stretch long and the air grows thick with unspoken dread, there comes a whisper that chills the soul. It speaks of a time when the very cradle of democracy trembled, when the marble columns of the Parthenon cast shadows over streets filled with the dying. Athens, the shining jewel of the ancient world, was about to learn that even gods can bleed. The year was 430 BCE, and war had come like a beast prowling at the gates. Sparta's armies encircled the great city, their bronze spears glinting in the Mediterranean sun, their war cries echoing across the olive groves. But Pericles, the golden-tongued leader of Athens, had drawn his people behind the long walls, those magnificent stone barriers that stretched like protective arms from the city to the sea. "Let them burn our fields," he declared, his voice carrying across the agora like thunder from Olympus. "We are children of the sea, not the soil. Our ships will feed us, our walls will shield us." The Athenians believed him, for why should they not? Had they not defeated the Persians at Marathon, their bronze-tipped spears drinking barbarian blood? Had they not built an empire that stretched across the wind-dark sea like a net cast by Poseidon himself? Their democracy was young and fierce, their culture blooming like flowers after rain. Sophocles was writing his tragedies in rooms perfumed with frankincense. Philosophers debated the nature of virtue in the shade of ancient plane trees, and artists carved marble until it sang with the voices of immortal beauty. Athens felt eternal, invincible, chosen by Gride Athena herself to lead humanity toward the light. The city had swollen beyond recognition. Refugees from the countryside poured through the gates like water through a broken dam, carrying bundles of precious belongings and memories of burning farms. They filled every corner, every courtyard, every sacred precinct. Children who had run free through wheat fields now pressed against strangers in narrow alleys, that reeked of unwashed bodies and desperation. The elderly, who had spent their twilight years tending vines and watching sunsets paint the hills, now huddled in spaces barely large enough for animals. But in that crowded sanctuary, pressed together like sheep in a pen, something else was stirring. It came not with the clash of bronze or the thunder of hooves, but in silence, invisible as prayer, merciless as time itself. It slipped through the gates that no Spartan could breach, past guards who never saw it coming, through walls that had been built to keep out armies, but not the breath of the unseen. The plague had arrived, and its hunger was infinite. At first, it was only whispers carried on the salt wind from Piraeus. A sailor collapsed at the docks, his face flushed with fever, babbling about fires that burned beneath his skin. A merchant's wife took to her bed, her body racked with chills. Despite the Mediterranean heat, her breath coming in shallow gasps that sounded like prayers to distant gods. Children cried in the night, their small bodies convulsing with pain no mother could soothe, no physician could understand. But these were scattered drops before the storm, single notes before the symphony of death began to play. The first to notice the pattern was Hippocrates' student, a young physician named Damon, who moved through the city's quarters like a priest, tending to the damned. He saw how the sickness leaped from house to house, how it chose its victims with seemingly random cruelty. A strong warrior would fall in hours, while his frail grandmother survived untouched. A priestess who had served Demeter for 40 years would perish while the temple slave who tended her lived. There was no logic to it, no justice, no divine plan that mortal minds could comprehend. Within days, the whispers became screams that echoed off marble walls and painted pottery. Thucydides, the historian who would survive to tell this tale, wrote of it with the precision of a surgeon cutting diseased flesh from healthy tissue. The fever came suddenly, he observed, like wildfire. In drought-cursed hills, men and women would wake feeling strong as Heracles, only to collapse before the sun reached its peak. Their heads pounded as if giants hammered against their skulls from within. Their eyes turned red as wine, then yellow as autumn leaves, then glassy as the surface of a windless sea. The symptoms arrived like actors in a tragedy, each more terrible than the last. First came the fever that made grown men weep like children, their bodies shaking uncontrollably, as if the earth itself trembled beneath them. Then the rash appeared, spreading across skin like spilled wine, marking the victims for death as surely as a brand marks cattle. Their tongues turned black and swollen, too large for their mouths, making speech impossible except for wordless moans that sounded like wind through empty tombs. Some threw themselves into wells, mad with a thirst that no water could slake, their parched throats crying out for relief that would never come. Others wandered naked through the streets, their minds shattered by the inferno raging within their skulls, their eyes seeing visions of Hades that others could not perceive. They spoke to the dead, reached for phantoms, danced to music only they could hear while their feet bled on the stones that had once echoed with the measured steps of rational discourse. The temples, those sacred spaces where mortals had spoken with gods since time immemorial, became charnel houses that reeked of death and broken faith. Priests fell at their altars, their final prayers dying on lips that would never again speak the ancient words. The sick crawled to the sanctuaries, seeking divine mercy, only to breathe their last on floors slick with blood and the bitter vomit that spoke of organs failing like broken pottery. Even Apollo, the far-shooting god of healing and plague both, seemed to have turned his shining face away from the city that had once honored him with hecatombs and golden offerings. The great festival of Athena, which should have filled the streets with joy and the air with hymns, passed in silence, broken only by funeral wails. The sacred olive tree, gift of the goddess to her chosen city, seemed to wither in sympathy with the people who had sheltered beneath its branches. The owls that were Athena's messengers no longer called from the Acropolis. They had fled to distant forests where the air did not taste of death and despair. In the narrow streets between the long walls, where refugees from the countryside huddled together like leaves blown into corners by winter winds. The plague moved like a hunter in the dark, patient and methodical in its harvesting. Entire families vanished within a single turn of the sun, their stories ending mid-sentence like scrolls torn by careless hands. Fathers who buried sons in the gray dawn were themselves carried to the flames by evening's purple light. Mothers who sang lullabies at midnight were silent by the next noon, their voices joining the choir of the dead that seemed to whisper from every shadow. The funeral pyres burned day and night, their smoke rising like incense to indifferent heavens, casting an eternal twilight over the city that had once blazed with intellectual fire. The flames consumed wood faster than it could be gathered from the dying countryside, until there was no more timber and bodies lay stacked like cordwood in the squares where Socrates might have questioned the nature of justice, where lovers had once met to exchange promises as eternal as the stars. The rituals that had bound society together for generations crumbled like autumn leaves. There was no time for proper burial rites, no resources for the honey cakes and wine libations that eased the journey to Hades. Bodies were thrown onto strangers' pyres or left to rot in houses that had become tombs. The sacred became profane, the holy became horrible, and the very foundations of civilization groaned under the weight of unburied dead and unanswered prayers. The democracy that Athens prized above all earthly treasures began to crack like pottery in an overheated kiln. Laws meant nothing when lawmakers lay dead in streets they had once ruled with wise discourse. Sacred rites were abandoned when there were no priests left to perform them, no citizens to witness them, no gods who seemed to care. Men stopped honoring their debts, ceased caring for their reputations built over lifetimes of careful cultivation, lived only for the moment's pleasure. For who could say if the sun would rise again on their breathing bodies? The bonds that held civilization together, duty, honor, reverence, the thousand invisible threads that weave individual souls into the fabric of community, dissolved in the acid of terror. Neighbors who had shared bread for decades now eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who would be next to fall, who might already carry the invisible seeds of destruction. Children abandoned parents too sick to care for them. Spouses fled marriages that had lasted decades, and the social contracts written in trust and tradition were torn up by hands that trembled with fever or fear. Some blamed the Spartans, whispering in corners that the enemy had poisoned the wells with some unholy magic learned from barbarian sorcerers. Others pointed accusing fingers at the gods themselves, crying that Athens had grown too proud, too bold in its ambitions, too quick to claim wisdom that belonged to immortals alone. Perhaps Athena had withdrawn her protection because her people had forgotten humility. Or Apollo had sent this plague as he had once sent pestilence to the Greeks before Troy, divine punishment for mortal hubris. But Thucydides, with his cold, historian's eye that saw through superstition to the bones of truth beneath, perceived something deeper and more terrible. He recorded symptoms with the methodical care of a physician studying anatomy, noting how the disease spread like ripples in a pond, how it struck without regard for virtue or vice, how it passed from person to person like an invisible flame, consuming everything in its path. Yet even he, with all his rational inquiry and careful observation, could not name the demon that devoured his beloved city. Was it typhus, carried by lice in the refugees' unwashed clothing, breeding in the cramped conditions where human dignity dissolved into animal survival? Was it smallpox, brought by ships from distant Egypt or Ethiopia, some African curse that found Greek flesh particularly sweet? Perhaps it was typhoid, born of fouled water, where the living and dead mingled, or bubonic plague carried by rats that had grown fat on the abundance of corpses. Modern scholars, armed with knowledge the ancients never possessed, have debated for centuries, like philosophers arguing about shadows on cave walls. Yet still they cannot agree on what precisely stalked the streets of classical Athens. Some propose it was a disease that has since vanished from the earth entirely, a plague child that lived and died in that terrible time like a malevolent god whose cult has been forgotten, leaving only ghosts in ancient texts and the echo of suffering in archaeological layers. Others suggest it was something familiar made strange by circumstances, influenza, twisted into new virulence by crowded conditions, or dengue fever carried by mosquitoes that bred in the water jars of the desperate. The mystery deepens when one considers the randomness of survival. Why did some households escape entirely while others perished to the last infant? Why did certain districts suffer more than others when the crowding seemed equally desperate everywhere? Was there some factor: diet, water source, previous exposure? Two similar ailments that protected some while condemning others. The dead cannot speak to tell us their secrets, and the survivors' accounts, filtered through centuries of copying and translation, raise more questions than they answer. But as the seasons turned and the plague finally loosened its grip like a strangler releasing a throat, Athens emerged, hollow-eyed and broken, a city that had looked into the abyss and found it staring back. The population had been cut by perhaps a third, some say more. The flower of an entire generation withered before it could bloom into the full promise of human achievement. Pericles himself succumbed in the plague's final throes, the golden voice that had guided Athens through its greatest triumphs silenced forever, leaving behind only echoes of speeches that had once moved hearts and changed history. The empire that had seemed destined to last 1,000 years, to carry the light of reason and democracy to every corner of the Mediterranean world, found itself stumbling like a wounded warrior, weakened in ways that went deeper than mere numbers. The confidence that had built the Parthenon, that had faced down the Persian host at Salamis, that had dared to question the gods themselves, that precious assurance had been cracked like marble struck by lightning, never to be fully whole again. War with Sparta would grind on for decades more, a generational struggle that would ultimately see both civilizations exhausted. But something essential had been lost in those plague-dark months: the faith that human reason could conquer all obstacles, that civilization was a fortress strong enough to withstand any siege. The Athenians had learned that their greatest enemy was not bronze, spears, or stone walls, or foreign armies, but something that dwelt within their own mortal flesh, patient as time, invisible as thought, inevitable as death itself in the end. What haunts us across the gulf of 25 centuries is not merely the riddle of what disease struck Athens like a thunderbolt from Zeus, but what it revealed about the terrible fragility of everything we hold most precious. Here was a city that had scaled the heights of philosophy and art, that had invented democracy and dared to dream of human perfectibility. Its theaters had echoed with the eternal questions posed by Aeschylus and Sophocles. Its schools had nurtured minds that sought to understand the very structure of reality. Its temples had housed the most beautiful objects ever created by human hands. Yet, in a matter of months, it was brought low by something so small it could not be seen with any instrument, so silent it gave no warning of its approach, so merciless it recognized no difference between the wise and the foolish, the just and the unjust, the beloved. The plague was democracy's darkest teaching, that death, at least, treats all citizens equally, and that the most reasoned discourse cannot argue with fever. The most beautiful art cannot charm the grave. The plague passed, as plagues do, leaving behind empty houses whose walls still echoed with conversations that would never be finished, unanswered questions that would haunt philosophy for generations, and a silence that seemed to contain all the words that would never be spoken by voices stilled too soon. But its shadow lingers still across the centuries, a reminder that no wall is high enough to keep out the darkness that dwells within our own frail flesh, no wisdom deep enough to fathom the mysteries that walk beside us every day, invisible and patient as eternity itself. Athens would rebuild, would create new wonders that would outlast empires, would burn bright again with intellectual fire before its final fall to Macedonian spears and Roman eagles. But it would never again feel quite so immortal, quite so secure in its glory, quite so certain that human reason could light every dark corner of existence. The plague had taught the city that birthed philosophy its hardest lesson, that some questions have no answers, some shadows cannot be illuminated, and some enemies cannot be defeated by courage or wisdom or the favor of the gods. And in the quiet moments before dawn, when the wind stirs the olive branches planted by Athena's own hand, and the marble columns of the Parthenon stand like silent sentinels watching over a city that has forgotten how to die, one can almost hear it still, that whisper of mortality that first came to Athens in the year 430 BCE, when even gods learned they could bleed, and even the children of light discovered that darkness lived in their very breath, patient and eternal and hungry for the feast of human dreams. Under the heavy heat of a July sun, Strasbourg had barely recovered from its strange summer of dancers when, across centuries and kingdoms, another shadow began to stir in whispers and in dreams. This time it did not seize the feet or the lungs, but the very breath of life itself. It was the mid-14th century, when Europe was already weary from famine and wars, when hunger gnawed at the edges of every household. Into this weariness came a terror borne on the backs of rats and hidden within the bite of fleeca blackness that spread without herald, without trumpet, but with the silence of a falling veil. The streets of Marseille, of Genoa, of Venice, first smelled of spices and trade, then of incense thickened with rot. It was the plague that would later be called the Black Death. But before it became myth, before it became the cautionary tale carved into stone and scripture, it was an intimate intrusion into the body, a swelling beneath the arm, tender and hot, that grew like a hidden bruise until it blackened the skin, a cough that deepened, wet and heavy, a fever that made the world swim in delirium. The body became its own funeral pyre, burning, collapsing, extinguishing. Within days, the strongest man, the most delicate child, the most pious nunnal were leveled to the same silence. Chroniclers describe how carts rolled through narrow alleys, the bells of the dead men tolling 4 doors marked with a red cross. "Lord have mercy" was scrawled across the lintels, though mercy seemed far from the horizon. In Siena, the painters abandoned their frescoes mid-stroke, as if the walls themselves had grown weary of beauty. In London, whole parishes disappeared, their names left only in registers inked with shaking hands. In Paris, physicians debated humors and planets, but none could stop the river of death. Some whispered it was punishment, divine retribution for sins too great to name. Others believed it rode on winds, on foul vapors, on corrupted stars. A few swore it was the Jews, poisoned wells, or witches because, when terror grips the mind, it seeks a human shape to strike at. And so, in fear's frenzy, towns turned upon themselves, burning, drowning, torturing innocents, in the hope that sacrifice might appease an unseen wrath. But the plague continued, deaf to prayers, to cruelty, to the flames of scapegoats. Imagine the sound of it, not the clash of swords, nor the thundering of hooves, but the slow unweaving of human life. The silence of markets emptied, the echo of footsteps in cloisters where monks once sang, whole villages abandoned, their fields swallowed by weeds, ships adrift in harbors, their crews long dead, sails sagging like funeral shrouds. Even the mighty church, so sure of its eternal dominion, faltered beneath the weight. Priests fled their flocks, bishops barred themselves in sanctuaries, while mendicants carried the last rites until their tongues too stilled. Faith, like flesh, grew brittle. Was God deaf, or had he turned his face away entirely? For many, belief cracked as easily as fevered skin, and yet, from the pit of despair, something strange emerged. Survivors carried a haunted light in their eyes, a knowledge that life was as thin as smoke. They built altars not only to saints but to time itself, for time had revealed its cruelty. A new art bloomed, macabre and unflinching paintings of skeletons leading men and women in dance. The danse macabre, where king and beggar alike were pulled into the same eternal rhythm. In those years, the world seemed to tilt, the old order strained. Laborers, who once bowed without question, now demanded more, for hands had grown scarce. Land shifted ownership like dice cast across a table. Kingdoms reeled, weakened not by enemies, but by emptiness. The Black Death had not just taken bodies, It had hollowed the very structure of society, leaving cracks where new voices could rise. Still, the true mystery remained: why did it come when it did, and why did it vanish like a thief at dawn? Why did it linger in one city and spare another? Why did it strike with such fury, then withdraw into silence, only to return again in later centuries? The question has echoed through generations, like a riddle whispered by the grave. Even now, the Black Death lives less as a chapter of history and more as a shadow across the human soul. It is the reminder that beneath stone cathedrals and crowned empires, beneath banners and laws, humanity is fragile as glass. That the might of kings, the brilliance of scholars, the prayers of priest Saul can be silenced by something too small to see, carried by vermin no one noticed, scurrying in the dark. Picture the final vision: a candle guttering in a narrow window, its flame fighting against the thickened air. Inside, a family gathered around a bed, eyes swollen with tears, their own bodies already marked by fever. Outside, the street is quiet, save for the creak of a wheelbarrow and the low toll of a bell. This was the symphony of the plague: silence, grief, and the relentless march of time. And when it, at last, receded, like a tide pulling back from a shore littered with bones, Europe rose again, but never the same. For those who had lived through it knew the truth that cannot be unlearned, that life is a borrowed flame, trembling against the wind. The memory of that silence never left them, nor has it left us. It began not with a cough, nor with swelling, but with a bead of sweat, harmless at first glance, like the body's natural response to summer heat or anxious nerves. Yet, in Tudor England, during the reign of Henry VII and his son, Henry VIII, that single drop could signal the beginning of a death sentence swifter than any plague Europe had known. They called it the sweating sickness. It came like a thief in the night, first striking London in 1485, the very year Henry Tudor seized the crown. Some whispered it was his curse, an omen of kingship tainted by blood and ambition. Others believed it was brought by foreign soldiers who had crossed the Channel with him. Whatever its origin, its presence was undeniable, and its terror unmatched. Unlike the Black Death, which lingered in swelling buboes, or the slow fevers of malaria, the sweat struck like a sudden storm. A man could be laughing at breakfast, pale by noon, drenched and trembling by afternoon, and lying cold in his shroud before nightfall. Chroniclers wrote that death came often within a single day. No time for prayers, no chance for last rites, only a desperate rush of terror as victims drowned in their own sweat. The symptoms were peculiar, unlike anything seen before. First came chills, sudden and violent, rattling bones and teeth. Then, the heaten, intense burning fever that soaked clothing and sheets in rivers of sweat. The body shook, muscles spasming, as though demons gripped them. Then exhaustion, crushing, irresistible. Most who succumbed slipped into a fitful sleep and never woke again. What made it worse was its unpredictability. It favored no age, no class. Noblemen and commoners alike fell victim. It could sweep through a court, sparing servants, yet striking lords. Even kings feared its reach. Henry VIII himself fled his palaces in panic at every whisper of its return, abandoning councils, wives, and courtiers alike. He forbade gatherings, closed the royal household, and isolated himself with only a handful of attendants. The monarch of England, who styled himself a demigod among men, trembled before the invisible sweat, and yet the disease was strangely local. It struck England hardest, flaring again and again between 1485 and 1551, but rarely touching France, Italy, or Spain. Foreign physicians marveled at its mystery. Why England? Why its damp streets, its crowded taverns, its smoky hearths? Was it a curse tied to the crown itself, a punishment bound to the island's soil? The common folk, seeking reason in terror, spun their own tales. Some said it rose from the miasma of Marsh's poisonous airs that rolled into London's alleys. Others believed it was divine chastisement, a reminder of human frailty. Still others whispered of sorcery, of poison brewed by enemies, of secrets known only to alchemists and witches. The sweat carried not only fear of death, but suspicion, accusation, and the tearing apart of trust. Imagine the city when it came, streets emptied, shutters bolted, churches rang with hurried prayers, but bells soon tolled for funerals instead. In taverns, mugs of ale were left untouched as patrons fled. Even physicians, armed with their bloodlettings and herbal draughts, often dared not enter infected homes. Families were left to face the sickness alone, listening to the sound of labored breathing and dripping sweat until silence claimed the room. And then, as suddenly as it came, it vanished. After 1551, the sweating sickness disappeared from England, never to return. Entire generations grew up haunted by stories their parents had told, but never witnessing it themselves. It slipped from life into legend, a phantom illness that mocked the best minds of the Tudor world. Modern scholars speculate it may have been a hantavirus carried by rodents. Some suggest anthrax, others an influenza unknown to modern science, but none can say with certainty. It remains an enigma, ghostly illness that came, killed, and departed without trace, leaving only inked chronicles and the unease of its memory. And yet its shadow lingers in history, for in its wake kings trembled, courts scattered, and the illusion of safety within castle walls was broken. The sweating sickness reminded England that no throne, no wealth, no lineage could shield one from the frailty of flesh. Even Henry VIII, with his armies and his ruthless will, lived in constant dread of sweat that might soak his bedclothes and end his reign in a single night. Picture it, the flickering torchlight in a Tudor manor, the rush of servants to strip, sweat-soaked sheets, the muttered prayers of a trembling physician. Outside, the summer air hangs heavy, yet those within feel only the chill of terror, waiting for the first bead of sweat to appear. The Black Death had hollowed Europe, but the sweat had mocked England specifically, as if the very island had been cursed. And though it left centuries ago, its name still drips with dread, the sweat that stole kings. It began not with a cough, nor with swelling, but with a bead of sweat, harmless at first glance, like the body's natural response to summer heat or anxious nerves. Yet, in Tudor England, during the reign of Henry VII and his son, Henry VIII, that single drop could signal the beginning of a death sentence swifter than any plague Europe had known. They called it the sweating sickness. It came like a thief in the night, first striking London in 1485, the very year Henry Tudor seized the crown. Some whispered it was his curse, an omen of kingship tainted by blood and ambition. Others believed it was brought by foreign soldiers who had crossed the channel with him. Whatever its origin, its presence was undeniable, and its terror unmatched. Unlike the Black Death, which lingered in swelling buboes, or the slow fevers of malaria, the sweat struck like a sudden storm. A man could be laughing at breakfast, pale by noon, drenched and trembling by afternoon, and lying cold in his shroud before nightfall. Chroniclers wrote that death came often within a single day. No time for prayers, no chance for last rites only. A desperate rush of terror as victims drowned in their own sweat. The symptoms were peculiar, unlike anything seen before. First came chills, sudden and violent, rattling bones and teeth. Then the heated, intense, burning fever that soaked clothing and sheets in rivers of sweat. The body shook, muscles spasming as though demons gripped them. Then exhaustion, crushing, irresistible. Most who succumbed slipped into a fitful sleep and never woke again. What made it worse was its unpredictability. It favored no age, no class. Noblemen and commoners alike fell victim. It could sweep through a court, sparing servants, yet striking lords. Even kings feared its reach. Henry VIII himself fled his palaces in panic at every whisper of its return, abandoning councils, wives, and courtiers alike. He forbade gatherings, closed the royal household, and isolated himself with only a handful of attendants. The monarch of England, who styled himself a demigod among men, trembled before the invisible sweat, and yet the disease was strangely local. It struck England hardest, flaring again and again between 1485 and 1551, but rarely touching France, Italy, or Spain. Foreign physicians marveled at its mystery. Why England? Why its damp streets, its crowded taverns, its smoky hearths? Was it a curse tied to the crown itself, a punishment bound to the island's soil? The common folk, seeking reason in terror, spun their own tales. Some said it rose from the miasma of Marsh's poisonous airs that rolled into London's alleys. Others believed it was divine chastisement, a reminder of human frailty. Still others whispered of sorcery, of poison brewed by enemies, of secrets known only to alchemists and witches. The sweat carried not only fear of death, but suspicion, accusation, and the tearing apart of trust. Imagine the city when it came, streets emptied, shutters bolted, churches rang with hurried prayers, but bells soon tolled for funerals instead. In taverns, mugs of ale were left untouched as patrons fled. Even physicians, armed with their bloodlettings and herbal draughts, often dared not enter infected homes. Families were left to face the sickness alone, listening to the sound of labored breathing and dripping sweat until silence claimed the room. And then, as suddenly as it came, it vanished. After 1551, the sweating sickness disappeared from England, never to return. Entire generations grew up haunted by stories their parents had told, but never witnessing it themselves. It slipped from life into legend, a phantom illness that mocked the best minds of the Tudor world. Modern scholars speculate it may have been a hantavirus carried by rodents. Some suggest anthrax, others an influenza unknown to modern science. But none can say with certainty. It remains an enigma, ghostly illness that came, killed, and departed without trace, leaving only inked chronicles and the unease of its memory. And yet its shadow lingers in history, for in its wake kings trembled, courts scattered, and the illusion of safety within castle walls was broken. The sweating sickness reminded England that no throne, no wealth, no lineage could shield one from the frailty of flesh. Even Henry VIII, with his armies and his ruthless will, lived in constant dread of sweat that might soak his bedclothes and end his reign in a single night. Picture it, the flickering torchlight in a Tudor manor, the rush of servants to strip, sweat-soaked sheets, the muttered prayers of a trembling physician. Outside, the summer air hangs heavy, yet those within feel only the chill of terror, waiting for the first bead of sweat to appear. The Black Death had hollowed Europe, but the sweat had mocked England specifically, as if the very island had been cursed. And though it left centuries ago, its name still drips with dread, the sweat that stole kings. It began not with a cough, nor with swelling, but with a bead of sweat, harmless at first glance, like the body's natural response to summer heat or anxious nerves. Yet, in Tudor England, during the reign of Henry VII and his son, Henry VIII, that single drop could signal the beginning of a death sentence swifter than any plague Europe had known. They called it the sweating sickness. It came like a thief in the night, first striking London in 1485, the very year Henry Tudor seized the crown. Some whispered it was his curse, an omen of kingship tainted by blood and ambition. Others believed it was brought by foreign soldiers who had crossed the Channel with him. Whatever its origin, its presence was undeniable and its terror unmatched. Unlike the Black Death, which lingered in swelling buboes, or the slow fevers of malaria, the sweat struck like a sudden storm. A man could be laughing at breakfast, pale by noon, drenched and trembling by afternoon, and lying cold in his shroud. Before nightfall, chroniclers wrote that death came often within a single day. No time for prayers, no chance for last rites, only a desperate rush of terror as victims drowned in their own sweat. The symptoms were peculiar, unlike anything seen before. First came chills, sudden and violent, rattling bones and teeth. Then the heat, an intense, burning fever that soaked clothing and sheets in rivers of sweat. The body shook, muscles spasming as though demons gripped them. Then exhaustion, crushing, irresistible. Most who succumbed slipped into a fitful sleep and never woke again. What made it worse was its unpredictability. It favored no age, no class. Noblemen and commoners alike fell victim. Could sweep through a court, sparing servants, yet striking lords. Even kings feared its reach. Henry VIII himself fled his palaces in panic at every whisper of its return, abandoning councils, wives, and courtiers alike. He forbade gatherings, closed the royal household, and isolated himself with only a handful of attendants. The monarch of England, who styled himself a demigod among men, trembled before the invisible sweat, and yet the disease was strangely local. It struck England hardest, flaring again and again between 1485 and 1551, but rarely touching France, Italy, or Spain. Foreign physicians marveled at its mystery. Why England? Why its damp streets, its crowded taverns, its smoky hearths? Was it a curse tied to the crown itself, a punishment bound to the island's soil? The common folk, seeking reason in terror, spun their own tales. Some said it rose from the miasma of marshes, poisonous airs that rolled into London's alleys. Others believed it was divine chastisement, a reminder of human frailty. Still others whispered of sorcery, of poison brewed by enemies of secrets known only to alchemists and witches. The sweat carried not only fear of death, but suspicion, accusation, and the tearing apart of trust. Imagine the city when it came, streets emptied, shutters bolted, churches rang with hurried prayers, but bells soon tolled for funerals instead. In taverns, mugs of ale were left untouched as patrons fled. Even physicians, armed with their bloodlettings and herbal draughts, often dared not enter infected homes. Families were left to face the sickness alone, listening to the sound of labored breathing and dripping sweat until silence claimed the room, and then, as suddenly as it came, it vanished. After 1551, the sweating sickness disappeared from England, never to return. Entire generations grew up haunted by stories their parents had told, but never witnessing it themselves. It slipped from life into legend, a phantom illness that mocked the best minds of the Tudor world. Modern scholars speculate it may have been a hantavirus carried by rodents. Some suggest anthrax, others an influenza unknown to modern science. But none can say with certainty. It remains an enigma, ghostly illness that came, killed, and departed without trace, leaving only inked chronicles and the unease of its memory. And yet its shadow lingers in history, for in its wake kings trembled, courts scattered, and the illusion of safety within castle walls was broken. The sweating sickness reminded England that no throne, no wealth, no lineage could shield one from the frailty of flesh. Even Henry VIII, with his armies and his ruthless will, lived in constant dread of sweat that might soak his bedclothes and end his reign in a single night. Picture it, the flickering torchlight in a Tudor manor, the rush of servants to strip, sweat-soaked sheets, the muttered prayers of a trembling physician. Outside, the summer air hangs heavy, yet those within feel only the chill of terror. Waiting for the first bead of sweat to appear, the Black Death had hollowed Europe, but the sweat had mocked England specifically, as if the very island had been cursed. And though it left centuries ago, its name still drips with dread. The sweat that stole kings. They called it a fire that did not burn with flame, a fire that consumed from within, invisible yet merciless, as though God himself had lit a torch beneath the skin of the living. It began in the humblest place, sin fields of rye swaying in the wind, in loaves of bread warm from the ovens of poor villages. The peasants ate, and within days the curse revealed itself. Fingers blackened, feet curled and rotted, flesh split open with sores like charred wood. And yet, what terrified most was not the gangrene nor the slow mutilation, but the sensation unbearable heat that seared through the bones. Men and women threw themselves into rivers, begging the cold water to quench the fire that no hand could see. But the water gave no relief. The burning remained. This was the sickness they named ignis sacer, the holy fire, but others called it the curse of Saint Anthony, for his monks clad in black robes embroidered with the blue letter. Tout took pity upon the sufferers and gathered them into their monasteries. They dressed wounds, soothed screams, prayed over bodies half devoured. To those dying, They offered the one medicine no physician could craft: compassion, a hand to hold in the furnace of pain. Yet even they could not always turn the fire aside. The afflicted wailed through the cloisters, their voices echoing like chants of the damned. The monks prayed harder. They prayed not only for healing, but for understanding, for none knew from whence the fire came. It struck the poorest first. Farmers whose bread was dark, coarse, cut from fields grown damp with strange mists. The nobles, feasting on wheat, were often spared, and so some whispered that the fire was a punishment, a divine judgment upon the lowly and sinful. Priests thundered from pulpits that lust, greed, and heresy had invited the scourge. Entire towns lined up in processions, barefoot, carrying relics, begging saints to lift the burning. Bells tolled in sorrow, while incense filled the air, mingling with the odor of rot from the afflicted. It seemed the whole of Europe trembled under a flame that had no smoke, no light, no end. But there was a darker whisper, one spoken not in churches but in hushed corners of taverns and by mothers to children trembling in the night, that the bread itself was cursed, that something lived within the grain, hidden, silent, patient. For it was always after the harvest, after the rye had been milled and eaten, that the fire came. A husband might eat a slice and fall to the ground in convulsions, limbs twisting, as if strings pulled them from the sky. A wife might awaken, screaming that her body was aflame, clawing at her skin until blood streaked her arms. Children were born weak and withered, as if touched by the fire before first breath. Some said witches had poisoned the fields. Others claimed demons had entered the crops. In truth, no one knew, and so fear multiplied like shadows at twilight. The chronicles tell of entire villages undone. In one French town, so many were struck that the bells tolled every hour, carrying the rhythm of death across the countryside. The afflicted crawled through streets on blackened stumps, their hands twisted claws. Mothers carried babes who cried as if burning alive, and amid this horror, visions began. Some victims spoke of saints shimmering before them, offering chalices of cool water. Others claimed to see angels of flame, swords raised, commanding them to repent. Many, lost in agony, became pilgrims, crawling on knees, bloodied to shrines of St. Anthony, begging his intercession. The monks received them, washed their wounds, fed them, prayed until their voices broke. Some recovered miraculously, as if a holy hand had brushed the fire away. Others died in peace, laid to rest in cloisters, heavy with incense and candlelight. Yet the mystery deepened, for the fire did not remain constant. It came in waves, one year searing through provinces, the next vanishing like smoke on the wind. Villages rebuilt, fields were sown again, hope returned till the fire awoke once more. This unpredictability was its cruelest trick. It left survivors trembling, knowing the invisible curse might already be planted in their bread, waiting for the right season to awaken. Some swore the devil himself scattered the seeds. Others feared it was a punishment tied to cycles of sin, a reminder that even bread, the staff of life, could become the blade of death. Historians would one day uncover the truth, that a dark fungus named ergot had nestled within the rye, releasing poison that constricted blood, starved flesh, twisted minds into visions. But in those centuries, it was not fungus, it was a curse, a holy flame, a test of faith. And faith was all the people had, for when the burning came, no physician's salve, no bleeding, no concoction could soothe it. Only the prayers of St. Anthony's monks, the slow toll of bells, the flickering candles over the broken reminded sufferers that they were not wholly abandoned. The order of St. Anthony grew rich on the offerings of nobles who feared the fire might one day reach their own estates. Their hospitals spread across Europe, sanctuaries where the burning were brought to die or, in rare grace, to live. The image of St. Anthony, staff in hand, pig at his feet, became a beacon of hope. To call upon him was to beg for the cooling of the fire. His symbol, the Tau cross, was etched on walls, worn on amulets, painted on doors. Even as physicians scribbled theories of overheated humors or divine punishment, it was the saint's name that lingered on parched lips. Imagine it, a hall lit only by tallow candles, rows of pallets where the dying moaned, monks moving silently with bowls of herbs and water. Outside, snow fell, muffling the world, while inside, the cries of those aflame echoed against stone walls. Somewhere a bell tolled, low and steady, marking the passage of another soul consumed. And yet, in the midst of this horror, hope flickered, a hand on a fevered brow, a prayer whispered into a deafened ear, a child, once writhing, now breathing, softly, saved from the fire's grip. It was in these small mercies that humanity endured. In time, the fire lessened, the waves grew weaker, the outbreaks fewer. Villages learned to watch their grain more carefully, though they did not know why. And yet the memory of those centuries remained, the fear of bread itself, the thought that the daily loaf might carry within it a living flame, haunted the minds of peasants long after the last outbreaks faded. Even now, in old texts and illuminated manuscripts, one finds depictions of blackened limbs, of monks bending over the burning, of angels warring with demons in the sky. The story became part of Europe's memory, a reminder that life's simplest gifts may hide death's cruelest masks. And so the fire passed into legend. Some called it punishment, others plague, others miracle. But perhaps it was all three, for in its burning, the people saw their frailty, their dependence, their longing for mercy. They learned that suffering could be endured if only someone would walk beside them in the night. And though the fire has gone, the echo of its cries lingers, like smoke that clings to stone long after the flames have died. The year was 1347, and autumn winds carried more than the scent of fallen leaves. Across the harbors of Messina, they carried death disguised in silence, hidden in the fur of rats and the tiny jaws of fleas. Ships docked under weary sails, their timbers groaning, their crews pale as parchment. On deck, bodies lay unmoving, faces darkened as though ink had spilled upon their skin. The plague had arrived. It was said the sailors had fled from the east, from trading posts along the Black Sea, where war and pestilence had marched side by side. But they had not outrun the shadow. They had brought it with them. And as the anchors dropped into Sicilian waters, so too did the anchors of fate sink into Europe, fastening the continent to a nightmare it could not shake for centuries. The people of Messina gathered along the shore to watch the ghostly vessels arrive. They expected merchants, silks, spices, promises of wealth. Instead, they saw men staggering like hollow specters, coughing blood into the sea, skin bursting with dark swellings. Within days, the streets filled not with celebration, but with processions of death. Doors were shuttered, candles burned low, yet no lock nor prayer could keep the invisible enemy from entering. The bells of churches tolled day and night until the sound became unbearable, as though the air itself had turned into a funeral chant. From Sicily it spread like fire, racing across dry fields. One city would awaken healthy, only to crumble by dusk. Entire families vanished overnight, their homes left silent, tables still set, food untouched, as though life had been lifted out by unseen hands. In Florence, Boccaccio would write of how love itself decayed, for mothers abandoned children, and brothers. In Paris, the learned doctors wrapped themselves in long robes, their faces hidden behind beaked masks stuffed with herbs and vinegar, believing the stench of flowers might keep the rot at bay. In London, carts rolled down the cobblestone streets, each dawn their drivers calling in hollow voices, "Bring out your dead," and the doors would open, one after another. As bodies were heaped like firewood, some whispered it was God's punishment. Others believed it was the devil's breath, sweeping down from the east like a curse carried on the wind. Flagellants walked barefoot across Europe, beating their own flesh with chains until blood streaked the stones, hoping their suffering might cleanse the sins of mankind. Priests preached of apocalypse, and visions of the four horsemen were painted. On the walls of monasteries, famine, war, pestilence, and death, riding together through the ruined fields of Christendom. Yet others, in silence, began to wonder if the divine had abandoned them altogether, leaving humanity to perish in its own darkness. The horror was not only in the dying, but in the rhythm of it. Buboes rose like black blossoms beneath the skin, first at the neck, then under the arms, then in the groin. They throbbed and burst, oozing foulness that stained the sheets. Fever burned, delirium followed, and within 3 days the body collapsed. The plague killed swiftly, mercilessly, without pause. Some men died while laughing at a jest. Some women fell mid-prayer, their lips still forming the name of God. Children vanished like sparks snuffed from a candle. Entire villages disappeared, their fields left to wild growth, their wells choked with silence. And yet, even in the blackest days, strangeness lingered. Some survived, untouched, walking among corpses, as though shielded by unseen hands. Lovers slept beside the dying, kissed their fevered lips, and yet arose unscathed. In the heart of pestilence, miracles of survival whispered like faint candles in a cavern of night. Did these souls carry some hidden blessing? Or did fate merely roll dice upon the earth, indifferent to prayers and tears? By 1350, the plague had scoured Europe. 1 in 3 lives was extinguished, perhaps more. Kingdoms faltered, castles stood hollow, their lords struck down as easily as peasants. Laborers vanished, fields lay untilled, bread grew scarce, and hunger gnawed at what death had not claimed. The world was unbalanced, as if the scales of heaven had been overturned, and yet, from ruin, something shifted. The scarcity of hands gave power to the living. Serfs rose to demand wages, the chains of feudalism loosened, and a new order, fragile but different, began to stir in the ashes of the old. Still, the memory of that darkness clung like smoke in the air. Survivors dreamed of black ships gliding silently into harbor, of bells tolling in endless echo, of streets where the dead outnumbered the living. It was not only a plague of the body, but of the soul, for faith had been wounded, trust broken, and the certainty of the eternal shattered. Humanity had glimpsed its fragility, naked against forces it could not name nor fight. What was the Black Death? The question lingers like an open wound. Was it carried in the blood of rats, the bite of fleas, the unseen hand of pestilence that drifts with caravans and ships? Or was it something darker, something beyond the measure of science and a curse that walked in the shadow of men, laughing as it turned empires into graves? The chronicles cannot answer. The bones, buried in countless pits, cannot whisper their secrets. The plague came, and the plague departed, leaving scars deeper than the skin, written into the marrow of memory. And so, when the autumn wind stirs, when bells ring too often in the night, one might still feel the echo of 1347, the shadow that slipped off a ship's deck and spread across a continent, reminding all who came after that civilization, no matter how proud, rests always on fragile breath. The marble of cities is nothing against the silence of death. The prayers of nations are but whispers when the world decides to darken. The Black Death was not merely an event, it was a silence, a shadow, a reckoning. And though centuries have passed, its steps are not forgotten. They walk still, faint, but eternal across the earth in the dry plains of northern China. Beneath layers of dust and time lie fragments of a forgotten voice. They are not scrolls nor books, but bones cracked, blackened with age, etched with strange symbols that whisper of the first attempts to speak with eternity. These relics, called oracle bones, belonged to the Shang dynasty more than 3,000 years ago. They are shards of shoulder blades from oxen and the flat shells of turtles, transformed into instruments of prophecy. It begins with a ritual. Fire. A priest kneels before the bone, its surface polished until it gleams in the dim light. Upon it, questions are carved, questions not of idle curiosity, but of survival, war, and fate. Will the harvest be plentiful? Will rain fall? Will the king triumph in battle? Will the child live or die? These questions are cut into the bone with careful precision, the strokes deep, as if slicing into the fabric of destiny itself. Then the bone is heated, pressed with a glowing rod until it cracks. The priest bends low, watching the fissures, spread like veins of lightning across the surface. In those cracks, he sees answers. In those broken lines, he hears the voice of gods and ancestors. The ritual was not spectacle, but necessity. For the Shang kings believed the ancestors were not gone, but near, hovering over the living, guardians of lineage, witnesses of human deeds. To ignore them was peril. To consult them was survival. Thus, the oracle bones became bridges between worlds, their jagged cracks interpreted like sacred maps. A straight line meant fortune, a branching fissure meant calamity. Each crack was a word, each symbol a whisper, each bone a scripture written not in ink, but in fire. But there was more than superstition here. What makes these relics uncanny is that they preserve the first known system of Chinese writing. Thousands of years before Confucius, before dynasties rose and fell, scribes carved questions into bones, leaving behind the earliest recorded thoughts of a civilization. Today, scholars can still read them, and the questions are startlingly human. Will the queen bear a son? Should we march tomorrow or wait? Will the sickness end? The concerns of kings 3 millennia past echo with the same anxieties that stir hearts today. In this, the bones do not feel ancient, they feel alive. Imagine the scene: a king sits cloaked in silence. Before him, the priest chants, the fire hisses, and the bone splits with a sharp crack. The king leans forward. His heart pounds, for in that fracture lies the weight of decision. If the bone says the gods favor war, he will send thousands of men to march beneath banners. If the bone says no, he will stay his hand. The destiny of a kingdom, the lives of countless souls, all rest upon a single line across a fragment of oxbone. It is here, in this tension between fire and silence, that the true terror of the oracle bones lies. Not in their mystery, but in their power, the power of belief. The Shang people trusted utterly in what the bones revealed. And so the bones became more than tools, they became fate itself. Armies marched, not because kings willed it, but because the ancestors demanded it through fissures in bone. Children were named because the cracks favored one syllable over another. Fields were plowed or abandoned because a priest traced his finger along a fracture. Humanity surrendered its will to bone and fire, and the bones spoke. There is something haunting in this surrender. It reveals a truth that stretches across civilizations. Humans have always sought patterns in chaos, always tried to wrest answers from the unknown. In Greece, they listened to the ravings of the Delphic oracle. In Mesopotamia, they read omens in the livers of sheep. In China, they listened to the crack of bone. And though methods differed, the hunger was the same, the desperate need. Believe that the universe speaks, that it offers signs, if only we know how to listen. Yet the oracle bones carried another legacy. For when the Shang dynasty collapsed, the bones were forgotten, buried in earth and time. Only in the late 19th century did they return to the world uncovered, not by archaeologists at first, but by apothecaries in Beijing's medicine markets. Turtle shells inscribed with strange marks were sold as dragon bones, ground into powder for healing tonics. It was only when scholars looked closely that they realized what they were: not medicine, but the lost scripture of an ancient world. Today, museums hold these bones in quiet halls, their cracked surfaces glowing under pale lights. Tourists pass by them without noticing, perhaps seeing only fragments of animal remains. But those who pause, those who look closely, see more. They see a dialogue across 3,000 years. They see the questions of forgotten kings, etched forever in bone, asking the same things we ask now. And they see the cracks, like rivers frozen mid-flow, still waiting to be read. What makes them unsettling is not only their age, but their endurance. The skin of the king has turned to dust. The priests are nameless. The palaces of the Shang have crumbled into earth, but the questions carved into bone remain. The ancestors still whisper from within those fractures. And perhaps, if we listen closely, the bones still answer. For what are we, if not the same as those kings of old? Do we not still seek signs in the randomness of life? We read fortunes in cards, in stars, in algorithms of data. We still ask the universe if tomorrow will bring war, or peace, or rain. We still search the cracks of our world for messages hidden within. The oracle bones remind us that mankind has always been haunted by its hunger for certainty. And perhaps, in the end, the bones laugh gently at us, for, though 3,000 years have passed, the questions are still the same, and the answers remain as fragile as fire. The oracle bones do not speak of gods, nor of destiny. They speak of Usov, our fear of the unknown, our trembling before time, our desire to grasp eternity in the palm of our hands. And in that way, they remain eternal. Snow fell like white ash over the desolate plains, softening the sound of death, but not its presence. The winter of 1910 in Manchuria was no ordinary season. It was a season of silence, of houses sealed from within, of doorways marked by the stillness of entire families who would never again open their doors. Beneath the frozen breath of the northern winds, a shadow stirred, something older than empires, older than kingdoms, something that had slept in the marrow of the earth until human hands, careless and hungry, awoke it once more. It began not with an army or an invasion, but with hunters, men wrapped in furs, faces cracked from cold, chasing marmots across the frozen steppe. Their traps clicked in the snow, their blades gleamed in the pale light, and their reward was meat and pelts to sell. But the marmots carried more than fur. They carried a secret written in their blood, invisible, waiting. The moment a knife pierced their skin, it entered the hunter's hands, their lungs, their breath. No one saw the danger. No one smelled the plague upon the wind. Yet within weeks, entire towns fell beneath its shadow. It was not the familiar form of plague that blackened flesh and swelled lymph nodes. This was something more cruel, more merciless, pneumonic. A plague that did not need the bite of fleas or the hunger of rats to spread. It leaped from mouth to mouth, breath to breath. A phantom carried on sighs, coughs, whispers. A mother breathing to her child. A husband leaning close to his wife. A priest kneeling to hear a last confession. In those breaths, the sickness lived. The first reports seemed small, an isolated hunter's family in the northern provinces. A cluster of deaths in a village where the air itself seemed heavy. But the frost was not enough to halt it. Instead, it seemed to sharpen its teeth. By the time the news reached the great towns of Manchuria, the plague had already outpaced it. Families fell in a night. A man would wake coughing blood, and by sundown be still, his breath gone, his body already stiffening in the relentless cold. The neighbors who had spoken to him that morning followed him to the grave before the week was out. The Qing Empire reeled. Officials sent word to Beijing, to the world beyond the frozen frontiers, pleading for help. Doctors came in armed, not with weapons, but with cloth masks, thin gauze tied across the face in a desperate attempt to stop what no hand could see. They walked through streets where shutters were nailed closed, where silence pressed against the doors of homes that had become tombs. When those doors were opened, when the officials pried them apart, the scenes inside were frozen in horror. Whole families seated around tables, their food untouched, their eyes glassy with death. Children curled against their mothers' mouths, red with blood, forever stilled in an embrace that offered no warmth. The plague did not discriminate. Rich or poor, peasant or scholar, the breath was the same, and the plague took it with equal hunger. In the train stations, travelers coughed into the winter air, and those who came near them were doomed. In inns, strangers shared warmth, and in that warmth the sickness leaped. Corpses piled faster than they could be buried, and in the frozen ground, burial was near impossible. Fires became the only answer. In the bitter cold, the pyres blazed like false suns, their smoke rising into the night, as though even the heavens were being choked. Yet amid this ruin, a strange resilience stirred. Doctors and officials began sealing homes where death had entered, marking the doors so no one would approach. The living inside sometimes perished with the dead, trapped by quarantine. Others survived, but in their silence they heard the sound of scratching on the walls, as though the very plague clawed at the wood, demanding to be let out. It was a war fought not with swords or rifles, but with isolation, with fire, with silence, and still. No one could say where it had come from. Some whispered that it was the curse of the marmot, that the hunters had broken a taboo older than memory. Others said it was the anger of heaven itself, descending in breath and frost to punish the corruption of men. In the cities, priests lifted prayers, their words muffled by masks, incense mixing with the acrid smoke of burning homes. Was it truly divine wrath, or something older, a cycle that returned when the earth was disturbed? The cold preserved more than the bodies. It preserved the mystery. When the pyres cooled, and the survivors walked again through the ghost towns, they found homes untouched except for the stillness inside. Faces frozen in terror, lips parted mid-breath, as though the soul had been snatched in an instant. Even today, whispers remain that in the permafrost lie seeds of that plague preserved in ice, waiting for the warmth of human hands to wake them again. The Manchurian winter was long. The fires burned into the night. The doctors, weary and veiled, in gauze, moved like specters through the streets, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. The empire trembled, for it had seen its fragility written in red breath upon the snow. And when, at last, the sickness ebbed and the silence grew less suffocating, no one could explain why. Did the plague burn itself out, consuming all it could touch until nothing was left? Did the frost finally lock it back in chains of ice? Or did it simply move on, seeking new lungs, new shadows, new places to linger unseen? The survivors never forgot the sound, the wet cough in the night, the silence that followed, the rattle of nails sealing the door. It was not just a sickness, they said. It was a presence, a thing that moved in the dark breath between two people, something as intimate as a whisper and as merciless as a blade. And so the memory of Manchuria's plague lingers, frozen in time. It is a story of hunters and prey, of breath and silence, of fire on snow. A story without an ending, because the ending may yet return, for the frost does not forget. Them once more, the pyres of families burning their dead in haste. Men who once spoke of honor and justice now fought like wild dogs over funeral space, shoving bodies into shallow pits before rushing away lest they too inhale death. The sickness showed no mercy. It clawed down generals and peasants alike. Even Pericles, the shining statesman, the man whose voice had once lifted Athens into glory, succumbed. His death was like the extinguishing of the last lamp in a chamber already darkened by fear. The people watched their leader slip away and felt that the city itself was being unmoored from its destiny. What was it? Even then, men argued. Some whispered it was smallpox, some murmured of typhus, others believed the gods themselves had sent a punishment too vast to be named. Some thought of Egypt, where pestilence rose from the Nile like mist. Others of Ethiopia, where the sun baked the earth until it split. Did the disease travel with merchants, hidden in grain, or in the breath of slaves? Or had it slumbered in the soil beneath Athens, waiting for the footfall of thousands pressed too close together? Thucydides himself survived, though he tells us the memory of the sickness never left him. He became both witness and scar. He describes how men abandoned laws, for what law could bind the dying? They abandoned temples, for what God seemed to listen. They abandoned hope, for even those who lived carried marks upon their bodies, reminders that they had brushed against the veil of the underworld and returned only half whole. Imagine standing on the Acropolis, once the pride of the world, while below the city's avenues fill not with song or theater, but with silence broken only by coughing, by the collapse of a neighbor against stone, by the crackling of hurried flames. Imagine a people once crowned with wisdom reduced to dust and fear. That was Athens in the plague year. Some said the sickness stripped men of their masks, revealing who they truly were. The noble became cruel, the selfish more selfish still. And yet there were others, those who carried cups of water to the lips of strangers, knowing the kiss of contagion might claim them next. Those who dug graves in secret, not for family, but for those left forgotten in alleys. In these acts, humanity flickered still, a weak flame against the storm. The war with Sparta dragged on, but the true enemy had already done its work. Athens, which had once been destined for unbroken triumph, found its glory curdling, though its ships still ruled the sea, and its theaters still carved beauty from shadow. The soul of the city had been scarred, and long after the last fever cooled, long after the massed graves sank into silence, the memory remained of a summer when the gods turned their faces away, when wisdom bowed to ash, when Athens, jewel of Greece, became the grave of thousands. Even now the scholars search for answers. Was it smallpox that hollowed the city? Was it measles, typhus, or some phantom sickness never again seen by man? The bones do not tell, the ruins do not whisper, but perhaps the truth is not meant to be known. Perhaps the plague of Athens was less a disease than a lesson, a reminder written in fire and fever that no city, no matter how radiant, can seal its gates against death. Close your eyes and hear it, the echo of sandals on stone streets, the sobbing of mothers, the distant shouts of soldiers on the wall, and over it all the silence of the gods, the silence that even now hums across the centuries, reminding us that Athens, for all its wisdom, was brought to its knees not by war, but by something smaller, unseen, and merciless. And as the night falls, as the torches gutter out, the city lies shrouded in stillness. Athenian marble, stained with centuries of rain, remembers. The bones beneath the soil remember. And though the living have long forgotten the scent of fever, the stones have not. They keep it, like an ember hidden in ash, waiting for breath to stir it once more. The The summer of 1793 in Philadelphia began with the sound of flies. They clung to the sweet rot of the docks, where barrels of coffee, split and forgotten, oozed their dark perfume into the humid air. The Delaware River swelled with heat, its surface sluggish, as if it too were choking on the stench of decay. The city, proud and new, the capital of a fledgling nation, felt itself trembling beneath the weight of a sickness no one could name. By August, whispers had become screams. Yellow fever had arrived, silent, invisible, and merciless. At first, it was only a few dock workers staggering home with burning foreheads, their eyes jaundiced, their skin flushed, and then fading into the gray of death. Families thought it no more than exhaustion, the ordinary fevers of summer. But then came the vomiting thick, black, bitter bile that tasted of blood and iron, staining linens that would never be washed clean again. A mother would die in her bed, and her children, clutching her hands, would not live to bury her. The city emptied. Carriages rolled out through the gates, carrying the wealthy, the politicians, the powerful, those who could afford to flee, left behind rows of shuttered windows and deserted marketplaces. Even George Washington departed, leaving Philadelphia stripped not only of its commerce, but of its sense of order. Those who remained heard the silence spreading faster than the fever. Church bells no longer tolled, for there were too many dead to mark each one. The graveyards overflowed, and the air stank of quicklime. Doctors walked the streets with masks of gauze, clutched like talismans against the unseen terror. They carried theories heavier than their instruments. Some said it was the miasma rising from the riverbanks, the foul air of stagnant water. Others whispered of the barrels of spoiled coffee rotting in the sun, exhaling poison into the lungs of every passerby. And there were those who bowed their heads, certain that heaven itself had grown impatient with the arrogance of liberty, that this fever was a judgment, not a disease. Matthew Clarkson, the mayor, stayed when others fled, his pen scratching letters. By candlelight, as the streets outside turned to cemeteries, he wrote of the horror in words trembling with both faith and despair. The Free African Society, led by Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, walked the deserted alleys to nurse the sick, bury the dead, and comfort the forsaken. Their dark silhouettes, moving with quiet grace through a city that had become a tomb, gave a flicker of humanity to the night. Yet even they were accused, when it was all over, of profiting from death. Such is the cruelty of fear that it remembers its saviors as enemies. Inside the fever's grip, families sealed themselves indoors. Windows nailed shut, doors bolted, as though wood and iron could hold back the invisible swarm. The buzzing in the air was not just rumor, but wings, mosquitoes breeding in rain barrels, cisterns, and the shadowed corners of gardens. Unseen, they carried the fever from body to body, until the very breath of Philadelphia seemed cursed. Each cough in the stillness felt like a gunshot, every touch a betrayal. There were nights when the city seemed drowned in firelight. Torches burned at every corner, not as celebration but as defense, for some believed flame could cleanse the air. But the fire did not stop the swelling of the dead. Carts groaned beneath the weight of bodies, driven by men who wore vinegar-soaked cloths over their mouths. Children peered through cracks in the shutters to watch them pass. Learning too early that silence was heavier than screams, By September, Philadelphia was no longer a city, but a shadow of one. Shops rotted with unsold goods, their counters layered with dust. Pews in the churches stood empty, hymnals untouched. Rats feasted in the taverns, gnawing at bread no hand dared claim. Death was not swift, but lingering: fever, delirium, jaundice, black vomit, collapse. Some died in hours, others in days, each gasping for air, in rooms that reeked of sweat and candle wax. Yet within this abyss there were flickers of defiance. Dr. Benjamin Rush, though mocked by his peers, worked tirelessly, bleeding patients with trembling hands, convinced that purging their bodies would purge the plague. His treatments killed as many as the fever, yet his persistence carved his name into the city's memory. Nurses and gravediggers, nameless and faceless, gave their lives in silence, becoming bones in the very graves they dug. Philadelphia was not abandoned by courage, though it was abandoned by fortune. The fever did not last forever. By the cold of November, frost returned to the cobblestones, and with it a reprieve. The buzzing stilled, the air cleared, and the dead no longer mounted in endless procession. The survivors crept back into the streets, their faces hollow, their voices muted. A city once vibrant with the promise of revolution now felt old, as though it had aged centuries in a single season. But the scars endured. Trust was broken. Neighbors remembered who had fled and who had stayed. The coffins buried in shallow earth still shifted when the rains fell, as if the city itself could not forget the weight it had carried. In the years that followed, Philadelphia rebuilt, but beneath its cobblestones, the echo of 1793 remained a heartbeat of dread beneath the hum of commerce, a whisper in the alleys that prosperity could not silence, and the question lingered. Long after the last fevered body cooled, was it only the mosquito, delicate and unseen, that carried such ruin? Or was it something older, more patient, something that seeped through the damp summer air like a ghost that refuses to leave? The fever had passed, but its memory never died. It still hums in the stone of Philadelphia, quiet but unyielding, like a warning carved not in ink but in blood. Even now, when the river runs black at twilight and the air hangs heavy with July heat, one might pause and hear it, the silence of a city holding its breath, waiting, remembering, fearing. For the fever sleeps, but sleep is not death. It began with a silence heavier than any sword clash, a silence that hung above the stone walls of Amboise like a curse whispered by unseen lips. The year was 639, and the land of Palestine swung beneath the fierce weight of summer. Dust clung to every garment, heat shimmered on every path. Yet it was not the sun that undid the strong, it was something darker, invisible, and merciless. A shadow spread across the garrison town, and with it came the rattle of fevered lungs, the cries of men once proud in battle, now broken by an unseen hand. The soldiers of Amboise's men, who had carried banners into conquest, who had bled in the deserts for empire and faith, found themselves kneeling not before an enemy of flesh and blade, but before a sickness that moved like smoke through the streets. Their swords rusted untouched, their armor gathered dust. No march, no campaign, no herald of glory, only the sound of coughing that deepened into silence, and the solemn toll of bodies carried to earth. It began with whispers. Some said the wells had soured, that the waters ran with death. Others muttered that the plague was a curse sent from Byzantium, lingering revenge for lands lost. But most spoke of the heavens. A divine test, they said, a fire sent not upon stone cities, but upon mortal flesh, to sift faith from fear. It was not the first plague the world had known, but for the believers in Amwas, it felt as though the unseen hand of God pressed heavily upon them. Among the stricken were no ordinary men, companions of the prophet himself, men whose words carried weight, whose very presence was a living link to the earliest days of faith, now found themselves laid low, shivering upon mats, fever burning their skin, lips cracked with thirst. Some prayed even as breath left their lungs, whispering words of submission until silence claimed them. Others, in their final delirium, cried out for the comfort of water or for the desert winds of home. The town transformed, once a place of order and discipline, with soldiers drilling in the courtyards and merchants plying their goods at the edge of the garrison. Now Amwas became a graveyard in waiting, streets emptied except for funeral processions. The sound of boots no longer signaled war, but the shuffle of men carrying their brothers to the earth. The air itself grew heavy with the smell of decay, the sweet, unbearable stench of death that clung to doorways and lingered even when the wind shifted, and yet strangely did not spread beyond. The surrounding towns held their breath, watching, waiting for the sickness to creep like a tide into their homes, but it did not. The plague, as though tethered to Amwas, chose its ground and feasted only there. Chroniclers, centuries later, would puzzle at this confinement. Was it bubonic plague, carried by rats, or typhus, born from filth and heat? Or was it something lost to the ages, a sickness with no name, a shadow that came once and never again? Faith wrestled with despair. Leaders urged submission, that death was but a passage, that those who died in the plague would be martyrs, rewarded beyond measure. But still, fear gnawed at the edges of belief. What is the worth of a sword when the enemy cannot be seen? What shield guards against the breath of the sick? And what comfort is promised when one's body burns and trembles, when one's children are taken in the night? There are stories of men who, despite the sickness, refused to flee. They chose to remain in Amwas, to tend to the dying, to bury the fallen. They washed the bodies, wrapped them, whispered prayers, and lowered them into the earth until their own limbs faltered with fever. Duty, faith, or resignation, it is hard to tell which guided them. But in their steadiness lies the last dignity of the town, for when walls collapse and cities fall, it is not the living stones that endure, but the memory of compassion and courage. The numbers mounted, thousands fell, rows of graves carved into the soil, earth hastily shoveled and patted down, names spoken quickly before silence claimed them. Amwas became a place of ghosts, where each shadow in the fading light might have been the echo of a soldier once proud, now walking unseen among the ruins. And when the sickness had finished its work, when its hunger had been sated, the silence deepened. The survivors, few and trembling, looked upon a town emptied of its spirit, its strength laid low beneath the dust. What lesson was left in the plague of Amwas? Some said it was a trial, that those who endured with faith passed through fire and were purified. Others said it was a curse, a reminder that no conquest, no empire, No earthly strength can shield a man from the frailty of flesh. For in the end, even the companions, the revered and the righteous, were not spared. The sickness chose without favor, striking rich and poor, strong and weak alike. The centuries carried the memory forward. Chroniclers recorded the tale, though the cause was never agreed upon. Physicians speculated, priests reflected, and historians debated. But in the quiet earth of Amwas lie the only answers, buried with those who once drew breath beneath its sun. Their tombs hold not only their bones, but their silences, silence as enduring as stone, as unyielding as the mystery itself. If you walk those lands today, if you place your hand upon the ground where the garrison once stood, you may still feel the hum beneath the soil, the restless whisper of lives cut short. The stones remember, even when men forget. And perhaps that is the truest plague, that forgetting, for when the dead are left unremembered, their suffering becomes a second death, one colder and more final than the fever that once claimed them. So, the plague of Amwas endures not in its cause, nor in its cure, but in its echo, a reminder that faith, though unshaken, must walk always hand in hand with frailty, that even the mighty are dust, even the faithful are flesh, and that beneath the sun of Palestine in the year 639 a shadow fell upon a town and did not rise. Again, they said, the air itself carried death, that it drifted through the alleys of Florence and London like a restless spirit, settling in the lungs of the unwary and snuffing out entire bloodlines before morning's bells. The year was 1348, when Europe's heart seemed to wither beneath the weight of pestilence. Cities rotted from within, their streets choked with the sick, their rivers swollen with the unburied dead. Yet, amidst this vast theater of despair, there rose one city whose fate seemed bent against the tide of ruin. The chronicles whisper of it with a mixture of awe and suspicion, while others drowned in grief. Milan stood tall, its walls intact, its people spared the full weight of the plague. Was it a miracle carved by divine mercy, or a cruelty so sharp and merciless that it severed the roots of infection before it could bloom? Milan was no ordinary city. Its stones had known both empire and rebellion. Its towers stood like sentinels of pride against the Lombard sky. In that year of darkness, when the horizon of Europe glowed with the funeral pyres of millions, Milanese leaders are said to have acted with a resolve as cold as the steel of their gates. At the first whisper of sickness, houses were marked. At the first sight of fever, flames were called. They did not wait for the pestilence to spread. Entire households were sealed within their homes, bricks laid upon their doors. And if the infection was certain, the walls themselves were pulled down, families consumed in fire-sick and healthy alike. The city became a fortress, not just of stone, but of terror. Children peered from shuttered windows, watching neighbors vanish overnight into silence. Streets once filled with laughter turned into corridors of suspicion. A cough was no longer the sound of common illness. It was a death knell, a whisper that walls might soon close in. And yet, in the silence that followed, the plague did not sweep through Milan as it had through Florence, Siena, or Avignon. For the survivors, it felt like providence. Priests sang of divine protection, of the Virgin's cloak spread over the city like a shield. The bells tolled in gratitude, Hymns rose against the silence of the graves beyond their gates. But others whispered darker thoughts, that it was not heaven, but the hand of man, hard and merciless, that preserved Milan, that survival had been bought not by faith, but by the blood of innocents entombed in their own homes, burned as offerings to a grim arithmetic of survival. Beyond Milan's walls, plague corpses lay piled in pits deep enough to swallow generations. Florence had lost half its breath. Siena was so hollowed that work on its grand cathedral ceased, never to be finished. In London, carts rolled through the cobbled lanes bearing cries of "Bring out your dead." But Milan's streets remained, if not untouched, then markedly different, quieter, haunted, yet not drowned in endless death. What truth lies behind the chronicles? Some say Milan's miracle was a matter of geography, that its marshes and rivers broke the chain of infection, that its climate slowed the hand of pestilence. Others argue that its walls and laws, brutal though they were, stemmed the flow. Perhaps the rats carried fewer fleas there. Perhaps the summer heat waned at the right moment. The scholars dispute. The voices of the past remained fragmented. Yet the legend persists. While Europe wailed in agony, Milan held its breath and endured. One imagines the city at night in that year, torches flickering against high stone, watchmen pacing the gates, ears straining for the sound of coughing from within. Inside the chambers of rulers, prayers mixed with decrees of death. To be spared, one must not only survive the pestilence, but the suspicion of one's neighbors. The silence that must have draped those nights was heavy, not of peace, but of dread held at bay. And so the city became a paradox, both sanctuary and tomb. Its miracle was not one of joy, but of survival sharpened into something bitter. Did the citizens truly thank heaven, or did they carry a private guilt for the fires that devoured their own kin? For though Milan stood, its heart must have trembled each time smoke rose from a home, each time another family vanished without funeral or farewell. Even now, centuries later, the story of Milan lingers like a half-forgotten prayer. Was it blessed or cursed in its survival? Was it proof that human resolve, when wielded without mercy, can bend fate itself? Or was it simply chance, the unseen roll of nature's dice, that left Milan standing when so many others fell? The cobblestones of the old city still hold their silence. Travelers who walk beneath its arches do not hear the wailing of Florence or the dirges of Avignon. They hear instead a quiet that feels uncanny, as though the city carries within it the memory of having stood untouched while the world drowned. Perhaps that is the true miracle, that survival itself can be its own haunting, that to live when others perish is not only a gift, but a burden. And in the end, Milan's story is not one of triumph, but of enigma. A city that stood in improbable light while the continent lay in shadow. A city that chose fire and stone over mercy, yet found itself hailed as blessed. And as we drift deeper into the silence of history, the question remains unanswered, whispered, like a prayer in the dark. Was Milan saved by heaven's hand, or by the cruelty of its own? The truth lies somewhere in the silence, between the prayers of the spared and the ashes of the lost. The streets were narrow, like veins carved into stone, shadowed by towering walls that leaned inward as if conspiring to keep the sky away. Edinburgh, in the 1640s, was a city of closeness, of bodies pressed together in alleys so tight that a man could stretch out both arms and touch damp stone on either side. In these closes, as they were called, darkness reigned even at noon, and the stench of refuse and breath lingered like an invisible fog. It was here, in these labyrinthine passages, that the fever first began to whisper. It was not a plague of buboes, not the black swellings that had terrorized Europe for centuries. It was something stranger, softer, as if death had chosen to move unseen. Men and women would go to bed shivering beneath thin blankets and rise no more. Children played one evening in the gutter's filth, laughing with the wild defiance of poverty, only to be found the next morning still and silent, their small faces frozen in repose, unscarred, untouched, yet lifeless. No sores, no boils, no trail for physicians to follow. Only absence. The people called it ghost fever. It came like a shadow, with no form, no warning, no reason. In the crowded closes, fear spread quicker than the sickness itself. Mothers clutched their infants tightly, as if their embrace might guard against the invisible. Neighbors ceased to speak across the stairwells, and silence replaced laughter, songs, and the drunken arguments that had once echoed in the night. Even the rats seemed to vanish, as though they too sensed something unnatural threading its way between the damp stones. Physicians of the day, their knowledge bound to humors and phlegms, could do little more than record confusion. They dipped quills into ink and wrote of sudden collapse, of skin cool to the touch, yet unblemished, of lungs that ceased without swelling, of hearts that halted as if struck by an unseen hand. Some thought it an ague born of stagnant water. Others swore it was a punishment for sin, a visitation sent to purge the city of its wickedness. Ministers thundered from pulpits, their words echoing across vaults of stone, warning that repentance was the only cure. But when the righteous fell as swiftly as the wicked, the sermons grew quieter, replaced by prayers whispered behind barred doors. The magistrates acted with the same cold discipline that cities had long used against plague. Houses were sealed, their wooden doors hammered shut with heavy nails. Inside, the living were entombed with the dying, and the dying with the dead. Through narrow cracks, neighbors heard muffled cries, then silence. Fires were kindled at night to cleanse the air, great barrels of pitch and tar blazing in the winds, filling the sky with black smoke. And yet, for all the terror, the fever did not swell into a citywide inferno. It flared in patches, consumed small corners of the city, and then abruptly it vanished. Like a ghost that had wandered through the wrong doorway, it departed as suddenly as it had come. By the time winter's frost glazed the rooftops, the fever was gone, leaving behind only uncertainty. No scars, no chronicles of thousands carried to pits, no mass graves like those that haunted London or Florence. Instead, Edinburgh remained standing, bruised but not broken. A city left staring into the void of questions, with no answers, than in the centuries that followed. Whispers of the ghost fever survived in fragment records, in parish books, fleeting notes in the writings of confused physicians. Some suspected influenza, though influenza rarely struck with such clean swiftness, leaving no lingering cough, no wheezing breath. Others proposed typhus, bred in the filth of overcrowded closes, but even typhus left rashes, marks, signs etched. on the flesh. The fever of Edinburgh left nothing, as if it sought only the soul, departing without so much as a blemish on the body. There is something unsettling about a disease that leaves no trace. The imagination fills the silence with specters. Perhaps that is why it has been remembered not as a sickness, but as a haunting. The closes, with their damp stones and echoing stairwells, still hold the memory. When the wind moves through them, carrying the scent of moss and the distant smoke of hearths, some say you can almost hear the faint sighs of those who fell not gasps of agony, but sighs as if they simply slipped into sleep and forgot to return. Standing in those ancient alleys, today the stones themselves seem to listen. They are stained with centuries of rain, layered with soot, worn smooth by footsteps long turned to dust. They were present when ghost fever walked unseen, when doors were nailed shut, when prayers mingled with the smell of pitch and burning tar. They remain silent witnesses to something that has no name, no diagnosis, no category in the ledger of medicine. Perhaps the strangest mystery is not how it began, but how it ended. Why would a fever with no cure, no prevention, no explanation simply stop? Did it consume itself? Did it tire of the city? Or was it never a disease at all, but something else, something that brushed against the world for a moment and then withdrew? The silence it left behind feels deliberate, like a door closed gently but firmly, leaving those within to wonder what had just passed. And so the ghost fever of Edinburgh lingers not in the body but in the imagination, in the stories told by candlelight when the wind rattles the window panes. It reminds us that not all plagues roar with fire and swellings. Some drift like mist, touch like a whisper, and leave only questions in their wake. In the stillness of midnight, one might almost believe that the fever was not an illness at all, but a visitor, one that entered the city through its narrow veins, stayed long enough to gather what it sought, and then vanished into the dark, leaving Edinburgh forever haunted by what it could not name. The bells tolled in the night, heavy with sorrow, their iron tongues crying into the darkness as plague crept silently across the land. But in some places, where despair should have reigned, hope flickered like a trembling candle. It was whispered that the saints themselves walked unseen among the faithful, shielding the devoted from the hand of death. In these times, when no physician's hand could heal and no wall could keep pestilence at bay, the people turned their eyes to heaven, not with quiet prayers but with desperate cries, summoning those they believed had the power to intercede. The streets of Palermo were thick with incense in the summer of 1624. The plague had come swift and merciless. Bodies blackened by swelling and fever carried through the narrow streets by carts that groaned like mourners. Yet there, upon Monte Pellegrino, the bones of Saint Rosalia were discovered in a cave, clothed not in flesh, but in sanctity. They were carried down with reverence, veiled in silk, lifted through the air as though heaven itself had sent them. The people believed they had found their protector. Processions wound like rivers through the city, thousands barefoot upon the burning stones, chanting, kissing the reliquary, as though in that kiss lay their salvation. And then, as if the city itself had exhaled, the plague began to ebb. Was it chance? Or did the saint walk among them, unseen, brushing aside the shadow of death with a hand of light? So it was, too, in the legends of Saint Roch. His image shows a pilgrim cloak torn, lifting his garment to reveal a wound upon his thighs, the mark of plague. And yet he lived, healed, wandering from town to town with a dog who brought him bread. In the darkest centuries, when death was everywhere, towns swore by his intercession. Priests raised his relics high in golden shrines, carried them through the streets as though they bore a shield against invisible arrows. There were places that endured when others fell, and the survivors swore it was the saint who had spared them. Saint Sebastian, too, was invoked, his body pierced by arrows in painted chapels and gilded icons. To those drowning in pestilence, the arrows of his martyrdom became a mirror of the arrows of plague that God loosed upon the earth. If Sebastian could endure, perhaps so could they. His image was everywhere nailed above altars, painted upon the crumbling plaster of churches, his body marked by pain yet luminous with grace. Whole cities marched beneath his likeness, chanting his name as though each word might turn aside the arrows aimed at their hearts. But the mystery lingers like smoke. Why? When one town was spared, another perished, though they prayed to the same saints with equal fervor. In some places, prayers rose like thunder, reliquaries gleamed in torchlight, bodies swayed in devotion, and yet the graves still filled. In others, the very same invocations seemed to pierce the heavens, and pestilence faltered. Was it coincidence, or was there something unseen at work? Perhaps the discipline of quarantine, the harsh wisdom of local rulers, hidden behind veils of ritual, kept the plague from spreading. Or perhaps, as the faithful believed, there are mysteries of grace that defy human reason. Miracles not carved in stone, but in the fragile beating of mortal hearts. Imagine the night of such a procession. Torches flare in the cold wind, there, smoke curling against the vault of heaven. Children clutch at the hems of their mothers' cloaks, while men walk barefoot on broken stones, lips cracked from fasting, eyes hollow from grief. Priests in tattered vestments lift high the jeweled reliquary, the bone of a saint glimmering within like a fragment of eternity. The crowd breathes as one, voices trembling on ancient hymns, the sound of desperation turned into prayer. Above them, the stars look on, silent, indifferent, or perhaps listening. And as they march, their tears fall not only for the dead, but for themselves, for the fragile hope that clings to them like smoke to cloth. In those moments, the boundary between life and death seemed as thin as the veil between earth and heaven. For the people, there was no question. The saints had the power to intercede. They had suffered, they had bled, they had died, and so they knew the sorrows of mankind. To invoke their names was to knock on the gates of heaven with hands of flesh and grief. Whether those gates opened was not for man to know. The chronicles that remain are not dry accounts of numbers and death, but songs of deliverance and despair, etched in trembling ink by monks who had seen too much. They tell of villages where St. Roch's banner was unfurled and no more died, and of towns where Sebastian's image hung in every home, and still the earth swallowed them whole. The truth lies buried in the silence of centuries, sealed beneath stone churches and forgotten bones. Yet the question lingers like a whisper. Was it mere chance that separated the saved from the doomed, or was it faith itself, force unseen, shaping destiny, bending the darkness for those who believed? Even now, when the saints are remembered in quiet chapels, their names spoken more as memory than shield, there remains a strange solemnity in their stories. The reliquaries that once paraded through plague-torn streets still rest in gilded cases, candles flickering before them. They gleam not with power now, but with memory of a time when the world was falling to pieces, and men clung to bone and prayer as to the last rope dangling over an abyss. Perhaps that is the truest miracle. Not that the saints spared some cities while others fell, but that faith itself endured. That in the face of endless graves, men still lifted their eyes to heaven, still lit their candles against the dark, still believed that help might come, even if unseen. The plague is gone, but the echo remains. In the silence of forgotten chapels, in the faint scent of incense lingering in stone, in the glimmer of candlelight on reliquary glass, one can almost hear it, the ancient hymns of those who once believed they were saved. And perhaps, in a way, they were. Beneath the heat of an Anatolian sun, where fields ripple like molten bronze, the ruins of Kaital-Yuk rise in silence. Once, nearly 9,000 years ago, these packed turf mounds throbbed with life smoke curling from hearths, children darting through narrow passages, the smell of roasted grain mingling with sweat and soil. Here was one of the first cities humanity ever built, a labyrinth of clay houses pressed close, each dwelling a womb of warmth, ritual, and survival. Yet beneath the plastered floors, beneath the painted walls of ochre and black, there lay secret bones, small and fragile, their surfaces kissed by a dust the color of dried blood. Archaeologists, brushing away centuries of silence, found the children first, infants cradled in shallow graves carved into living floors, their skeletons marked with red ochre as if painted by ritual hands. Some were wrapped with care, bound in the tenderness of mothers who could not bear the separation. Others were hurriedly hidden, their resting places crude, as though placed there in desperation before the next wave of sorrow arrived. Each burial carried a story that was never spoken, a prayer that was never answered. The people of Kaital-Yuk had lived with death as part of life. They built homes upon homes, layers rising like memories pressed into clay. When a dwelling crumbled, another was raised on its bones, and so to the bones of kin lay beneath them ancestors, beneath sleepers, the dead holding up the living. But here, in these ochre-stained remains, something darker flickered. It was not ritual alone, not custom. It was haste. It was fear. It was the shadow of an affliction no hand could stop. What disease had stalked these newborn streets, this cradle of humanity's first city? The bones do not speak clearly. Some whisper measles, though its earliest traces are thought younger than these graves. Others mutter plagan, ancestor of the Black Death, long buried in time, rising for a moment to drink the blood of children before sinking back into silence. Still others see famine and contagion entwined, hunger weakening the young so that invisible sicknesses slipped in and claimed them. Yet none of these voices can prove their claim. What remains is the crimson dust, the red that cloaked them, a color both sacred and tragic. Imagine the homes at that moment, the closeness of bodies in small, windowless rooms, fires breathing smoke into lungs already heavy with fever. A mother holding her child, feeling warmth turn to coldness, as if a flame had guttered in her arms. the air filled with the copper smell of blood, the soft wails of the living carried into the night, and the silence of the dead lying only inches below the earth upon which the survivors still walked. Çatalhöyük was not like later cities, with streets and open air. It was a hive, its houses sealed together, entered only from the roof. One roof touched another, and the people moved like shadows across a city of flat tops, descending ladders into their enclosed hearths. In such closeness, disease moved as swiftly as whispers, unseen yet certain. One breath, one cough, one touch, no walls could keep it out, for the walls themselves were made of earth that crumbled, dust that clung to hands, clay that drank the sweat of the dying. Still, there is mystery here, for the burials are not only of sorrow, but also of meaning. The ochre dust that cloaked the small bones was no accident. It was ritually eerie pigment, a symbol of blood, of rebirth, of some passage beyond flesh. These people, at the dawn of history, believed that the red soil could carry the spirit onward, could shield it, could make death something less final. In their grief, they reached for eternity with what little they had. Earth itself, ground into powder, pressed upon their children's remains as a last blessing, and so we stand, millennia later, staring into these graves with questions unanswerable. Was this a plague known only to the first cities, a sickness that came and went like a phantom, leaving no mark upon the record of the living? Was it hunger disguised as fever, or fever disguised as hunger? Or was it something stranger, still a curse of closeness, the price of humanity gathering together, birthing the city, but also birthing death's new appetite? The silence of Çatalhöyük does not break. Its clay walls hold their secrets, its plastered rooms guard their sorrows. The children lie still, their bones fragile as dried reeds, their red-stained dust whispering of hands that once trembled to cover them. All that endures is the truth that even at the dawn of civilization, when humanity first built its great hives, something unseen waited, something hungry, something that demanded its tithe. Perhaps that is the true miracle and the true curse of Çatalhöyük, that in those first houses, beneath those first roofs, we see ourselves, the warmth of community, the strength of closeness, and the shadow that follows both. Disease has always walked beside us, patient as stone, waiting at the threshold of every city, every home. 9,000 years ago, in a city of clay and smoke, it claimed the youngest and the most fragile. And though the city fell silent, the pattern remained, repeating itself through Florence, through London, through Edinburgh, through every place where humans gather. The bones of Çatalhöyük remind us that the past is not gone, but buried. Buried in ochre, buried in silence, buried in dust older than memory. And when the wind moves across Anatolia's plains, stirring the soil of that ancient mound, perhaps some part of that red death still lingers, invisible, eternal, patient as ever. Night falls heavy over the Caribbean, and with it comes a silence that is never truly silent. In the damp streets of Havana, where lamps flicker against cracked stone walls, there lingers a shadow deeper than the dark. It is not born of moonlight, nor of the sea's endless breath, but of a fever that once rose from the earth like a curse, unseen yet merciless, carried on wings too small to be noticed. They called it many things, the yellow fever, the pestilence, but in Havana it was remembered with a name that tasted of dread upon the tongue, the black vomit, the 18th century, dressed Havana in finery, swollen with sugar, tobacco, and chained human souls. Gold clinked in merchants' pockets, and the music of the streets mingled with the crack of whips in the plantations beyond. The city pulsed like a living heart, rich, proud, defiant, gleaming with the promises of empire. Yet beneath the wealth, beneath the laughter and prayers, something waited. It drifted through shutters, hovered above stagnant pools, slipped into flesh with the gentlest of bites. The price for Havana's prosperity would be paid, not in coins, but in blood. The fever began like a whisper heat rising under the skin, a trembling in the joints, a weakness that no rest could mend. Faces flushed, eyes turned glassy, and within hours, bodies burned as though the marrow itself were aflame. Then came the jaundice, turning eyes and skin the color of dying leaves, a yellow mask of death's approach. Dark, clotted blood poured from the mouth, staining floors and hands, proof of organs dissolving, of life collapsing inward. A soundless terror, the gurgle of a throat drowning in its own ruin. Soldiers who landed with the empire's banners never raised them high. Galleons arrived with battalions and left with corpses, wrapped hastily in canvas and tossed to the sea, the salt swallowing them whole before the city could bear witness. Havana became a place of unending burials, pits dug before dawn, filled before dusk. Priests walked the streets with incense swinging, the smoke curling upward in defiance of the stench of blood and bile. Their prayers mingled with cries from the living, and even their voices faltered when the fever took them too. The people did not understand. How could they? To them, the air itself seemed cursed. Some whispered of miasma, poisoned winds drifting from swamps. Others said it was punishment for sin, the wrath of God upon a city fattened by greed. Desperate mothers pressed amulets of saints against their children's foreheads, kissed rosaries until their lips cracked, pleaded with heaven to shield them from the unseen terror. But heaven remained silent. The fever spared no one by faith or status. The merchant's son coughed up blood beside the slave. The governor's daughter lay yellowed beside the soldier. Havana's wealth turned to ashes in trembling hands. For silver could not bribe death, and yet, strangely, it did not always strike with equal cruelty. One year, it stormed through the city like fire, devouring thousands in weeks. Another, it merely smoldered, sparing many, leaving physicians baffled. They bled the sick, purged them, drowned them in tonics of herbs and mercury. None of it mattered. The fever came and went as it pleased, obeying no law of man or prayer. Ships carried it across oceans, but Havana remained its chosen throne, the place where black vomit was most feared, most remembered. The irony was crueler still. Spain's empire stretched across seas, fed by gold and conquest, yet it was not defeated by rival armies or rebellious colonies, but by a creature no larger than a fingernail, the mosquito, an invisible executioner carrying in its fragile body the seeds of ruin. Each bite was a sentence written in blood, a silent promise of fever to come. Of course, they did not know this then. They could not imagine that death rode the air on fragile wings, and so they searched for blame elsewhere. The poor, in the Africans, brought in chains, in the foreign soldiers whose bodies crumpled first. All the while, the true killer drifted unnoticed, humming in the humid night. Even centuries later, when the mystery was unmasked, when the mosquito was named and its cycle laid bare, the memory of Havana's black vomit remained more than science could explain. For why, people still asked, did some outbreaks rage like wildfire, while others slept like coals, waiting for breath? Why did some survive, clinging to life against all reason, while others perished within hours? Was it chance, or a hand unseen that marked some for death and others for mercy? The city remembers still. It lingers in the stories of old houses, in the worn stones of streets that once ran dark with sickness. They say that at night, when the air is thick and unmoving, the ghosts of Havana's fevered past rise again. You can hear them in the silence between the waves, in the faint rustle of curtains stirred by no breeze. Mothers singing lullabies to children already lost, priests whispering prayers to a God who never answered, soldiers gasping their last. The sound drowned in blood. The empire has long since crumbled, its wealth scattered, its power broken. But the black vomit of Havana remains, a shadow that never truly left. It is the reminder that empires are fragile, that no fortress, no gold, no army can shield mankind from what waits in silence. That even in a city of light, the smallest of shadows can turn streets into graves. And so Havana keeps its secrets. The harbor still glimmers, the music still rises, but beneath the beauty is the memory of fever of yellow skin, black blood, and the silence that followed, a silence more terrifying than any cannon, more final than any war. For the dead of Havana left no monuments, only whispers. Whispers that the living carry, even now, when the night grows too heavy and the air feels too still, and one wonders if the hum of wings in the dark has come again.